Beck is a singer-songwriter from Los Angeles, California, who has been kind of a figurehead of alternative music, back when there was alternative music.
It's sort of funny to think about Beck as such a veteran artist at this point. I think in some ways we still think about Beck as the alternative rock kid. You know, you still think of Loser, you still think of Where It's At, you still think of the hits that sort of put him on the map.
I think this thing we're seeing now is that Beck is kind of normcore. Beck is kind of normal now. He's just chilled out, and I think that's maybe part of why he is nominated again now for Album of the Year.
Beck to me was a little bit of a surprise because the album, even though it was acclaimed, did really fly under the radar this year.
This was a little bit of the outsider nomination. You know, that said, if there was gonna be something from sort of, you know, more cool modern rock world, Morning Phase was certainly one of the records that was most critically acclaimed, most embraced.
I think expectations for the album insofar as they existed were mostly from the fact that it was billed as sort of a successor to his breakthrough Sea Change album in 2002.
Baby, our love. Baby, our love.
The thing that, to me, that Beck is most known for, or was most known for early on, was this very Gen X, Gen Y kind of irony. Then, you know, Sea Change was this record where he went through this horrible breakup of a really long-term relationship, and all of a sudden, he was sort of walking wounded, and you got this really sincere, really damaged, really kind of vulnerable record. And that's what he's done again with Morning Phase.
So you listen to a song like Lost Cause from Sea Change, and then you listen to Hard as a Drum from the new album Morning Phase. You know, they're very similar. The albums are similar. There's a lot of acoustic guitar in both of them, but they both have beautiful arrangements. Even the album covers kind of look alike.
So for those who haven't been keeping up with Beck, he has been doing some unusual things in the time between Modern Guilt and Morning Phase. He did a blues singles series with Jack White's Third Man Records for a song that I love called I Just Started Hating You Today.
Look up heaven's ladder, see the angels climb down.
Beck's been busy. He put out this album, but in the form of a book of sheet music called Song Reader. And then he went back and had all of his friends record different songs from the album, and he recorded one himself called Heaven's Ladder. Other than that, he worked on a bunch of his friends' albums. He produced an album for Stephen Malkmus from Pavement, he produced an album for Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, and he worked on Jenny Lewis's record. And then other than that, he had this thing called Record Club, where he and his friends would cover an entire album by an artist. He did a Yanni album, he did a Leonard Cohen album, he did an INXS album. So Beck's been really busy for the past few years.
Bottles and cans, or just clap your hands, or just clap your hands.
Beck has worked with a lot of different genres over the years, but when you boil it down, there's really two Becks. There's silly, goofy Beck, and that's the guy who did Loser and Where It's At. And then there's the more earnest Beck, and that's the guy who did the Sea Change album, and that's the guy who did Morning Phase. And I kind of think that that's the guy who has a better chance of winning Album of the Year at the Grammys.
I think the earnest Beck that we see on this album probably stands the best chance of winning that he's had in over his career. The Recording Academy likes the narrative of an artist that sort of grows up and comes into their own and makes more quote-unquote serious music, and I think in a lot of ways this fits the bill for that.
If he were up against U2 or the Arcade Fire record from last year, I think that Beck would have totally different chances of winning. Funky Beck works when he's against really staid people. If he's against like Steely Dan, you know, Funky Beck works as a foil, but Ernest Beck works in this group.
He's not the center of culture. He's not, you know, the near center of culture. He's more on the fringe and more catering to an established fan base, as opposed to crossing over like some of the other artists in the categories have.
Alternative music is not that old, but because it's not yet classic rock, we're seeing what it means to age. And I think Morning Phase for Beck is a record about sort of, he's aging gracefully.